Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Earlier this week I completed my final D&D session for Autism Nova Scotia, at least for this time of the year. They break during the summer and focus more on like summer camp kind of stuff, but in the fall there's a chance that the same group may be starting back up again. So hopefully that all goes perfectly smoothly and I can kind of go back to running for that group. But I wanted to sort of talk about some of my experiences running for it. And I'm not going to go into like specifics about individuals or anything like that, but just the overall adventure that we ran and some of the experiences that we had and some of the just the fun that we had. So the first thing that I want to say is that it was a really enjoyable experience. Most of these kids, there's only one person in the group that actually had any real experience with Dungeons and Dragons, so the other three individuals were basically learning from the beginning, like they had little or no exposure to it whatsoever. And it was really cool to see over the course of the game sessions to see them get more and more comfortable with the reading their character sheets, getting more and more invested in what was going on, and just really starting to kind of come out of their shells a bit and really enjoy playing the game. And it's when you see something like that happen, especially I think when it comes to a younger generation, when you see these younger kids get really invested in what's going on, it's just one of those things that just makes me feel really, proud to be part of this hobby. It was just a wonderful experience. The best part was to see them interacting with each other, especially by the last session. By the last session, they were actually formulating plans. They were trying to come up with ideas together. And that was what the whole thing was all about. So it did, it did its job there. It's kind of a shame that we only had the 7 sessions over a 14-week period. It would have been nice to go for at least another couple, but it was still a really great time. The adventure that I ran is actually available for you to view on my Patreon page. It's now open to anyone who just wants to go there and visit it, and it's a PDF there. Or you can go onto my Facebook page, and if you go into the notes section, I created it as a note because you can't upload PDFs to Facebook without going through this really convoluted process. So I just did it simply as a note, but you can see it there. I'm not good at naming things, so the adventure was the title was, I think, like Larceny in Baldur's Gate. Just the overall premise is that the city of Baldur's Gate has started to experience a crime wave, with homes being broken into, businesses being broken into, and people being robbed. This has been going on for quite some time, but throughout most of the background, it was limited to the outer city or the lower city, which is never really the guards' priority. But recently, citizens from the upper city, which is where the nobility and some of the the wealthiest individuals in the city live, their homes started getting broken into, and now suddenly it's kind of an issue. Eyewitnesses had seen shadowy figures disappearing into some sewer access, grates or covers or things like that, to make their getaway, but there was nothing really solid to go on. Now, members of the Watch, really weren't interested in trudging through the sewers, so they outsourced it to the player characters. The characters entered the sewers, and they kind of went and explored around there a little bit. There was one week where it ended up being sort of like a lost week because I ended up getting pretty badly sick. So the other volunteer that was part of the program working alongside of me, he took over, but I didn't send the full adventure over. I just basically, I don't even know if, I think I had it completely written at that point, but I just just basically said, have them continue to explore the sewers for the session, because they're only 2-hour sessions, and that's one thing that I would probably have worked around better, knowing how it kind of played out, because that first adventure, which I was thinking would take 3, maybe 4 of the sessions, ended up taking 6 of the 7. So anyway, I'll get to that sort of later on. So there was the one missing week of where they just kind of kept going through the sewers to find this lair, but it turns out that the thieves that have been terrorizing the city or stealing from these nobles was actually a group of goblins. So the player characters arrive, and because this was a game for kids, and I wanted to keep things kind of lighthearted as much as possible, so the first room that they kind of enter into when they enter the sewer lair because they had a rogue in the party, so I made sure that the door, they could, pick the lock and stuff like that. And I set the DC low enough that for their first check, he had a relatively good chance of success, and, he did. So they were able to kind of sneak in through the entryway to this lair. And this guard room that had like the weapons racks and tables with like, daggers and stuff on it, and suits of leather armor and all these things. There was a table in one of the top corners of the room that there were 3 goblins sitting at, and they were playing their version, I guess, of poker. They were playing a card game. And 2 of the goblins were actually arguing with each other over the rules. And the part that the group laughed and thought was funny was they were kind of observing what was going on, because this was pretty heated, and all the focus was on these 2 goblins. The third goblin, who was just sitting calmly at the table, the player characters noticed that he sort of like subtly reached over and stole a few. They were betting on copper pieces, so stole a couple of copper pieces from one of the other goblins' pile, put it in his own. And then he reached over and did it to the other one, and then, set it down. And then, like, the combat erupted. The player characters had a list of items. I didn't actually write the list out. I just, whenever they entered a room, they found something, I would let them know that these were items off the list. Mainly because I didn't want to come up with, like, hundreds of different, items. Well, maybe not hundreds, but, dozens and dozens of different items. Because I didn't want the focus to be on just reading what's on the list. I wanted the focus to be on going through the adventure. But they go through, they encounter some, so the goblins were keeping some giant rats that they were trying to domesticate. So they encountered those, and, fought some goblins. And the leader of the goblins, again, I wanted that encounter to be humorous as well. So when they enter this big dining area, they see this, like, fat, gross-looking goblin sitting at the head of this table. They're eating what could generously be described as gruel. And he has this giant rat on his lap. Now, the fat goblin, the leader, took it upon himself to help himself to a few of the items that were taken from the nobles. So this goblin was wearing, like, this silver tiara with, I think it was like not emeralds, I think it was like sapphires or something inlaid into it. He had a matching pair of earrings that he was wearing, and he had like this gaudy looking, like, pearl necklace. And his pet rat, who was named Princess Fluffykins, because that's a name that he actually got from an animal bed that was stolen from some small kid's, room. Princess Fluffykins was also wearing like these ruby earrings and had this like diamond-studded collar on. And this otherwise, so these really nice, adornments on it. And it's just this like gross, like slimy looking, because it's been going through the sewage, like just this really nasty looking rat. So they end up, fighting those individuals. They ended up killing the rat in one attack, which set the chieftain off, and he focused all of his attention and rage on the person that killed his precious Princess Fluffykins. And, excuse me. And, they ended up actually, what was even kind of, more humorous was one of the players was playing a cleric, and he had the command spell. So he, used command grovel on the chieftain. And the chieftain rolled a natural 1 for his wisdom saving throw, and they had a -1 to their wisdom. So that was a 0 result. So basically it was so effective, he just drops to his knees and starts like, kind of crawling towards the characters, hoping, for forgiveness and apologizing for everything that he's ever done, starting with when he was just this little baby goblin and, stealing from his brother or something like that. So there's all these things that he was apologizing for. But, as he kind of calms down, they apprehend him, they tie him up, and they learn from him that the goblins are actually working for a human wizard. The human wizard is not there. He left Baldur's Gate probably a couple weeks before the characters arrived, or I guess a couple 10 days, since it's Forgotten Realms. But they know that his room was beyond, the dining room. So they go through, and this is where things kind of shifted away from being humorous to being a little bit more serious. And so the player characters, they make their way into this, where this wizard's room is, and the door leading into it was this like double door that was painted up to look like there was like a flight of dragons in the background. And the dragon theme is going to kind of be pretty heavy in this one. So they open up the door, which I think it was locked, and the rogue can, use his open or disabled device or sleight of hand to open up the door. Because I keep getting the additions confused in my head. Anyway, he opens the lock. They enter the room and they see, he's got his lavish-looking bed, he's got a writing desk next to the bed, and a wardrobe in the top corner of the room next to the door. On the opposite side, there is a treasure chest. The treasure chest is, carved again or decorated again to have like dragon imagery on it. And there's this large door that leads to presumably another room that itself is carved to look like a massive dragon's head with its mouth open. On the walls, painted along the walls, are 6 skeletons. So like on the 3 walls, other than the one that had like the door that they came in through, each of those walls had 2 skeletons painted on it. And the skeleton paintings would actually move to observe the player characters, and they noticed this very easily. Like the head, it's not one of those things where it looks like the eyes are moving, like the head's actually physically turning in this painting. And as it turns out, those skeletons were actually guards for the treasure chest. So they, look at the chest. One of the players gets a little too impulsive, unfortunately. And what ends up happening, he opens up the chest. It wasn't locked, but he opens it up without, the rogue disabling any traps or anything that was on it. And so these painted skeletons actually emerge from the walls, and the players have to fight them. A couple of the characters ended up going down in this fight, just because you were getting low on hit points. They were still first level at this point, and they weren't going to gain second level until the end of the adventure. So a couple of the player characters did end up going down, but there was a cleric who could ensure that I think he had the grave domain, so he could make sure that nobody actually died. They would just get knocked unconscious, and then he could revive them at the end of the fight with some of his other abilities that he had. So they fight the skeletons, and as they defeat each skeleton, the skeleton just kind of just disintegrates into this puff of smoke that gets sucked back into the wall, and then the skeleton is just inert. Like, it doesn't move, it doesn't do anything, but it does return to its original position. So it would probably reset after a period of time. They defeat the skeletons. They get the downed party members back up. They still had their hit dice left. Most of them did. So I allowed them to I didn't allow them, but they decided to take a short rest. After taking the short rest, they go through the next door that had the big dragon face on it. They did let the rogue check this one, and it was trapped, so that if somebody tried to open it, it would do this, like basically the equivalent of like a burning hand spell. So the rogue was able to disable that. They get through the door, and they find what looks like probably the treasure room, where all the items would have been kept. There were several empty sacks and barrels in the room, as well as just a few copper pieces kind of scattered across the floor. But on the far side of the room was this, large stone dragon statue. It looked like a red dragon. And in front of this red dragon statue were a couple of small chests and a couple of barrels. So the characters, again, one of the players was a bit impulsive, and so he decided that he was going to, just run up and investigate those barrels and chests and stuff, which, other people tried to warn him about, but there reaches a point where you just have to sort of kind of let them know that they can do whatever they want, but there's going to start being consequences. So he runs up, takes the rogue with him, I think, to search for traps, but as soon as they get near the statue, it was designed to animate. The statue also had a mechanical device in it that allowed it to use, again, a fire breath weapon and a 15-foot cone for 2d6 damage, and it could do that 3 times. I chose 3 because I thought, it's sort of a good callback to the old school D&D days when dragons only had their use of their breath weapons 3 times, instead of it like recharging or like getting back after 1d4 plus 1 rounds or on a 5 or a 6 recharge roll, just to have that set limit. But they end up overcoming the statue and gaining their second level and finding a fair portion of the items that were on the list that was given to them. They didn't recover all of it because the wizard had gotten away with a decent sized amount of the items that were on that list. So going back into the wizard's room, they investigate there and they find a map as well as a journal. So the journal was hidden, and the journal actually wasn't written into the adventure, but one of the players wanted to search around to see if they could find anything, and I figured they didn't really get the journal from the Goblin's room. The Goblin leader, in his private room, he actually had a journal that he was keeping, but it's like, so they didn't really find that one, so I just had it be the Wizard's instead. And they find out that the Wizard, his name is Zeru, and if that name sounds familiar, I did take it from the D&D adventure game for 3rd edition. That was one of the adventures I actually did get the live stream in for. But I always liked that name, and I like the look of that character, so he's kind of my reoccurring evil wizard character. And they learn a little bit about him. So he was actually originally an apprentice wizard from Thay. He was an aspiring red wizard. I guess he had just achieved the ability or the rank of a red wizard. He traveled to the Sword Coast with his master to assist the Call to the Dragon. And this was sort of a callback to the Tyranny of Dragons storyline, which had canonically happened in this campaign world, although I didn't go into that many details. But as he was learning from the Call to the Dragon, he really came to venerate and respect these dragons, and much more than, he found a deeper personal connection to these dragons than he did the Red Wizards of Thay, and particularly Zastam. So he ended up betraying his master and stayed in the Sword Coast, where he learned about one dragon in particular. And this was a dragon that I just created for my campaign setting. The name is also taken from Dungeon Magazine, because again, there was a really cool adventure with this dragon in it that I'm sort of basing the overall premise of this actually on. And so the dragon's name, I just said, it's written in there, but it's really, it's too difficult to actually pronounce. So the commoners, the humans, the villagers and the townsfolk of the Sword Coast simply referred to this dragon as Flame. And Flame was like a scourge of the Sword Coast kind of thing, before he was defeated by a band of adventurers. And Zeru is trying to find a way to resurrect Flame, to return him. So he's got several different groups of, monstrous humanoids scattered throughout the Sword Coast, trying to basically steal enough funds to fund his research, as well as to present Flame with a treasure hoard that he would consider to be worthy of a dragon of his stature, sort of a way of bribing the dragon once he does bring it back to life to not kill him, sort of thing. So they disrupted the ring in Baldur's Gate, but there was a map that he had of the Sword Coast, and the Baldur's Gate had an X through it, and then there was a circle around the town of Daggerford. So that was kind of presumably the next step. So the player characters, again, they got to enjoy their rest after that. They accomplished their goal, and they bought a few items. One of the players, I think, had just watched not Guardians of the Galaxy, the Avengers Infinity War, because he was kind of obsessed with getting an Infinity Gauntlet. So he wanted to get this golden gauntlet that, they also found like an emerald, each of them. I made sure that there was enough for everyone there. And so he wanted to have this Infinity Gauntlet, basically. And it's like, well, it's going to be, pretty expensive to get a golden gauntlet. And, they were just getting into second level. They had, I think, around 100 gold pieces each. It's like, it's going to cost more than that. It was like, can I get a silver one? It's like, silver one's probably still going to be outside of your, your thing. It's like, but if you want, for this amount, you can get a leather one that's painted gold. And he's like, well, can I get a copper one? And it's like, sure. So I gave him this copper gauntlet that he had his emerald in, and I had it embedded into the gauntlet, which made him happy. It has no mechanical effects on anything whatsoever, but it's just something that he really wanted. I wanted to make sure that the price was sort of realistic, but I let him have it because why not? So so after that, and this was the last hour of the session, so there wasn't much more to go off of because this was the last session, but I wanted to at least plant the seeds for the next adventure, hoping to restart. So the characters, having recovered from everything, started making their way towards Daggerford, following the map. They get they're traveling for a few days, and they're about a day or so outside of the town itself when they come across this covered wagon that was just stopped in the road about 200 feet ahead of them. One of the characters, one with the best passive perception, was able to hear, this like deep guttural voice shouting what they assumed to be commands, and some humans, or more like humanoid voices talking in common, or human voices talking in common, basically begging and pleading with them. And what the scene was is that a band of orcs had stopped this wagon and were looting it. So they looked a little bit closer. They found like this one, kind of boss orc, and the humans were kind of pleading with him, and he was ignoring them. They also spotted two other orcs on either side of the road, a few feet away, hiding behind some bushes that the other humans may not have noticed. And you could see like the wagon itself was shaking, like there was some rummaging, and you could hear sounds of stuff being tossed around in there. So the player characters, at this point, I wanted them to really work on strategy. So it's like they're 200 feet away. How do you want to deal with this? And at first, some of them wanted to just run up and attack, which is like, well, you can, but the rest of the group doesn't really seem all that keen on it. And this was the part that was the most rewarding, because they started actually formulating a plan. So the wizard in the group and the warlock in the group both had the ability to cast Disguise Self. The warlock could do it at will, and the wizard had it prepared. So they decided that they were going to, the plan that they finally settled on was that they were going to settle on posing as an orc for the warlock, and because the spellcaster who was, the wizard was a dwarf, he decided he was going to pose as a goblin, because, instead of having this much shorter orc than the others, he was just going to be this little goblin. And the other two characters, which were a paladin and the cleric, they were going to be wearing these like cleric's robes, these these traveling heavy like cleric's robes. And the rogue decided that he was going to stealth his way up to a nearby bush and hide behind it, to act as cover if anything happens. And so they do all that. The paladin, who was a dragonborn paladin, and the cleric that was a human cleric, kind of like just made it look like their hands were tied up, and they were on this wagon that they had purchased, and they were kind of driving the wagon while the warlock posing as an orc and the dwarf wizard posing as a goblin just sort of make their way towards these orcs, and they were going to pass themselves off as having captured them, and were going to be taking them somewhere else, which is not a bad plan. There was one kind of important detail, though, that they overlooked, and I wasn't going to say anything, I wasn't going to give any hints, because at this point, it's something that they need to start thinking these things through, and one of the best ways you can learn is by having, something kind of go horribly awry. But as they're approaching, and they're at the point of no return, because they've actually walked up, and there's two other orcs that came out of the wagon with their arms just filled with stuff. And these two orcs saw them, and before I got to say anything, one of the players was like, wait a minute, do any of us know how to speak orc? And there was sort of a silence, because nobody knew in the group how to speak orc, even though they were posing as orcs. So I just said, one of the orcs that just emerged from this wagon looks directly at the other, the warlock who was posing as an orc, and I just said, speaks to you in a language you don't understand. And the player was like, I'm going to pretend that I'm a mute. And I'm like, really? And they were like, yeah, I'm going to pretend that I'm mute and I can't understand what they're saying. And I can't speak back. So Garrett will make a deception check, because they said that they were going to like just mimic or mime that, they can't talk. So it's like, make your deception. And they did, and I made my insight check to combat that. And their insight checks were awful, absolutely terrible. I think the highest I rolled was a 4 for the two orcs. So they, I just said, okay, they understand, and then they turned to the goblin, and they addressed the goblin in the same manner. And the player playing the goblin is like, I pretend that I'm deaf. And I'm just like, really, both of you? Like, and it's like, yeah, I'm gonna pretend that I'm deaf. It's like, okay. So make your deception check, and the player got a 19 for their deception. +1, I think, for their charisma. So they ended up getting a 20 total. It's like, well, okay. So at this point, I had them actually roll with advantage, because the odds of both of these traveling companions being completely and totally unable to communicate with one another just wasn't going to work. So I gave them advantage, and they still failed. And the group lost it at this point. Everyone was just, laughing, just super loud, and they were really enjoying it because it's like, this really ridiculous ruse worked. Eventually, combat did break out, and they were able to defeat the orcs and kind of drive them off. But it was a really, really awesome way to end because everyone was just so into it. They had a blast, everyone was laughing, and I'm hoping that will lead to the group wanting to continue come the fall. So that was sort of what happened as far as like the adventures that I ran go, and I'm hoping to have the second adventure fully written up and available on my Patreon in the next couple of days, and I'm also hoping to have it available on my Facebook page about a week after that. So I will be still writing these adventures. I'm still going to write the complete story arc out anyway, even if I don't get a chance to run it for this group, because I may try to do something else with some youth somewhere, like at a children's hospital or through schools or something like that. I still want to have these adventures ready to go. Overall, like I said, it was a very rewarding experience, and it's always just amazing to see like the next generation really start to develop a love of Dungeons and Dragons, and it was something that was really, really great. On my shelf behind me, I actually have a thank you card that one of the players actually handwrit and drew stuff on there, including a portrait of their character. And it just meant the world to me to get something like that. So it was just a really amazing and rewarding experience. And again, just to see these people who didn't really know each other start to sort of develop an actual friendship as time sort of went on, and they started getting more comfortable talking to one another. And it was a really just a great, great experience. The one thing that I will say is that if anyone out there who has a love of Dungeons & Dragons and wants to do some sort of volunteer work, or has an interest in working with youth, try to use D&D as a way of helping these kids. The point of this was to develop social skills, which started to happen by the end. On top of them trying to learn like the rules of the game, they started to get more and more comfortable with one another, and I'm hoping that it will continue to allow that to progress even further, because it was an absolutely amazing thing to see form in front of you. So again, if you are at all interested in doing anything along those lines, consult, maybe children's hospitals, local schools, youth groups. There's all kinds of ways that you can kind of go about doing this. If you do, if there are autism support groups in your area, go to them and just say, there's people that have been using Dungeons and Dragons to help, children with autism. So I'd be interested in doing something similar. Is there a way we can work something out? I just think it's really, really awesome. It's one of the most rewarding experiences that I've had in a very long time. So it was a great, great time. Anyway, I just wanted to sort of share that experience with you guys. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. Hoping to get back on with them again in the fall. I am still looking to do volunteer stuff with Autism Nova Scotia outside of D&D. I'm actually going to be doing something in about a week's time to volunteer with them. So I want to keep that going because it was a really great, rewarding experience. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next time. Take care.